Hello. For another video that I'm working on, I read The Radical King by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is edited by Cornel West. I found myself captivated by just how radical Dr. King was, and I was especially surprised by his philosophy of nonviolence, and I was inspired to dive deeper into the works of other nonviolent philosophers like Gandhi, Bayard Rustin, and Nelson Mandela. I discovered that nonviolence is not a passive philosophy or supportive of the status quo. It actively charges us to completely change how our society is oriented. It's a revolutionary philosophy. Much like Dr. King himself, the radical nature of nonviolence has been marginalized and overlooked. This video is meant to counteract that narrative and explain just how radical nonviolence can be. Before we get started, a couple disclaimers, okay? This is going to be a video about the philosophy of nonviolence. There's a subtle but important difference between the philosophy of nonviolence and just nonviolent action. Nonviolent actions are exactly what they sound like: protests or campaigns that do not use violence. Using nonviolent action does not require that one subscribes to the philosophy of nonviolence. In this video, I'm going to refer to the philosophy of nonviolence as simply nonviolence. I'm clarifying this because I'm going to say things like nonviolence is inherently anti-individualist, and that might be confusing to someone who hears nonviolent action is inherently anti-individualist. Anyone of any philosophical background can use specific nonviolent actions. Instead, what I mean is that subscribing to the philosophy of nonviolence also entails anti-individualism. The second disclaimer is I'm going to use a lot of quotes in this video from historic philosophers of nonviolence, and unfortunately, they were not perfect. For example, Gandhi features prominently in this video, but Gandhi was known to have young girls sleep in his bed with him in order to demonstrate his restraint and not touching them, which is pretty gross. Gandhi was also known to hold some pretty racist views about African people. Similarly, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a reverend for an evangelical sect of Christianity. And so, of course, some of his views about patriarchy and women have not really stood the test of time. And I don't want to make excuses for these men or for any of the people I talk about in this video. It's right to be critical of bad ideas. But despite Gandhi's racism, he has inspired many revolutions in Africa. Despite MLK's sexism, he's often cited by feminists today. Nor do I want to deify any singular individuals as if they accomplished what they did all alone. Angela Davis says,
"Because I've come to recognize that his legacy is not the legacy of an individual. It is a collective legacy. When we pay tribute to Dr. King, we pay tribute to the vast numbers of people who stood together in unity to proclaim that they would never surrender to the forces of racism and inequality."
I hope we can separate the good from the bad and recognize that we all have a role to play in the movement of history. Nonviolence is commonly misunderstood to be a passive philosophy. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nonviolence isn't about passively letting injustice happen. As I was reading and listening to the advocates of nonviolence, I quickly discovered that they advocate nonviolence first and foremost because it is effective. Nonviolent movements have achieved numerous amazing, lasting, and revolutionary successes. Welcome to the Tatum History Corner. Tatum, come back. Come back over here. We're doing Tatum History Corner. I have to do this, okay? Come on, over here. Okay. Tatum History Corner, okay? So, Tatum, welcome to Tatum History Corner. We're going to be talking about the nonviolent movement in India. It's okay, I can meet you where you're at. Welcome to the Tatum History Corner, okay? Today I'm going to be telling Tatum about some nonviolent history, okay? So, the first one we're going to talk about today, Tatum, is India. In India, in 1882, the British, who were the colonizers of India at the time, they introduced what was called the SALT Act. The SALT Act made it illegal for any Indian to produce salt independently, okay? So they had to buy this heavily taxed British imported salt. About 50 years later, after the SALT Act was introduced, Mahatma Gandhi began his campaign for Indian independence. So the principle that guided Gandhi's campaign was what he called satyagraha. Satyagraha kind of means like non-cooperation. To demonstrate this plan of civil disobedience, Gandhi and his followers, they marched to the coast and they scooped some salt from the ocean. There was like mud flats where water had evaporated and there was salt left over. And apparently picking up this salt out of the ocean was a violation of the SALT Act. And it kicked off a whole wave of protests where Gandhi and thousands of his fellow Indians were imprisoned by the British. But after months of demonstrations, it forced the British to negotiate with Gandhi, and they repealed the SALT Act. It was this kind of nonviolent demonstration that inspired Gandhi and his followers to commit to further actions, okay, Tatum? So salt was a central symbol in this movement. Yeah, get comfy. And so it inspired some boycotts and some strikes and other things against the British. Okay, some people refused to pay their taxes. Some people didn't send their kids to school. There was mass resignations from government jobs. There was even the creation of the Indian National Congress. And so eventually, as we know today, India is an independent nation. And Gandhi continues to be a much beloved symbol of nonviolent resistance around the world. What do you think, Tatum?
There are some published studies that try to determine how successful nonviolent actions are compared to violent ones. Erica Chenoweth is a researcher at Harvard who claims that nonviolent civil resistance movements were twice as successful as violent campaigns between the years 1900 and 2006. In their book, Why Civil Resistance Works, they detail many more examples to support that claim. But there's a lot of nuance here, and no movement has ever been purely nonviolent. But nonviolent tactics do work. They are not passive, but they require direct action and confrontation with those in power. Almost every major advocate of nonviolence has gone to jail for their actions. None of these people advocated nonviolence as a way of neutralizing a movement, but to the contrary, it was the nonviolent movements that inspired people to overthrow their oppressors. When I was reading these nonviolent philosophers, I was surprised how often they would condemn inaction even more harshly than violence. Here's Gandhi.
It is better to be violent if there is violence in our hearts than to put on the cloak of nonviolence to cover impotence. Violence is any day preferable to impotence. There is hope for a violent man to become nonviolent. There is no such hope for the impotent.
Chenoweth explains that an important aspect of nonviolent resistance is creativity. Nonviolent movements must find creative ways to attain their goals without violence. We can consider a list of actions used by nonviolent movements from Judith Butler's book, The Force of Nonviolence. Welcome to the School of Nonviolence. We're going to talk about some nonviolent protest tactics. Our first tactic is the boycott. In 1879, the Irish National Land League was formed to campaign against the high rents charged to their British colonizers. The Irish National Land League targeted the English land agent named Captain Charles Boycott. The entire town, including the laborers who worked for him, ostracized Captain Boycott, and he was refused service at the local shops. His blacksmith, his laundress, and his mailboy all refused to do work for him. Eventually, some volunteers came to help Captain Boycott, but they all ended up eating his food and crowding up his house. Eventually, Captain Boycott was forced to leave Ireland, and this increased the power of the Land League and put them on the negotiating table with their British colonizers. Our next tactic is the strike. On February 6, 1919, the city of Seattle was shut down by the general strike of 60,000 union workers. The elected strike committee coordinates supplies, food, and peace in the city, while the unions and other workers refused to go to work. The government sent in the military, despite the strike remaining nonviolent for the entire 5-day period. Our next tactic is similar. It's the hunger strike. In 2013, 30,000 prisoners across California went on a hunger strike to protest the overuse of solitary confinement in California prisons. After 2 months of refusing to eat, the strike prisoners won a settlement from the federal government agreeing to change the rules around solitary confinement. In 1969, over 50 students at Duke University occupied the Allen Administrative Building on Duke's campus. They barricaded themselves in the building for the entire day to bring attention to the needs of the African American students at Duke, including asking for an African American Studies Department, a black student union, and increased enrollment for black students. This happened 2 years after students had performed a study-in at the university president's office for 7 hours, protesting the use of segregated facilities by the university. Some other actions are sanctions, petitions, and public assemblies, but what is violent is controversial. Consider some recent examples. When the Tennessee lawmakers Justin Jones and Justin J. Pearson protested their legislature's lack of action on gun control, they were considered violent because they used megaphones in the legislature office. Megaphones are violence, but laws that protect gun manufacturers from liability are not violence. Tearing down Confederate statues, violence, but the threat those statues represent, it's not. Throwing soup at artwork to protest climate change is violent, but denying asylum to climate refugees apparently isn't. When water protectors disable an oil pipeline, that's violence, but when oil companies build pipelines through indigenous communities, that's not. Demonstrating outside the Supreme Court Justice's house is violent, but forcing people to give birth, that's not. What is violent? Perhaps you do not consider some of the things in that list to be nonviolent. Is occupying a government building really nonviolent? Is a boycott or a strike nonviolent if it prevents some people from getting things they need? When something can successfully change the status quo, oftentimes those actions are redefined by those in power to be violent, simply because they are actually effective. This is how the British justified jailing Gandhi, because his salt march and boycotts were somehow violence against British rule. Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed under similar pretenses for his marches against segregation. We shouldn't really fall for this trick, though. Throughout their book, Butler describes how what we consider violence is based on our perspective, and governments, because they claim a monopoly on violence, attempt to warp our perspective on what violence is and is not.
Okay, welcome back to Tatum's History Corner, okay? Tatum here, very sleepy, but he's listening, okay? Tatum, today we're going to talk about Zambia, all right? So in the 1940s and the 1950s, the British attempted to unite their two colonies of Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, okay? The unspoken goal of this federation was to solidify the white rule in the Southern Rhodesia. Okay, the mostly black government of the North was going to be overpowered by the Southern government of Southern Rhodesia. So the African National Congress, the ANC, in the North, they attempted to organize some boycotts and strikes, but the British were pretty insistent about federation. So as resistance grew, a new party called the United National Independence Party, which came from the Zambian African National Congress, the UNIP, they grew, okay, and they were led by a man named Kenneth Kaunda, who's often called KK in Zambia. He was a student of Gandhi and Nonviolence. The UNIP and Kaunda, they traveled across rural Rhodesia and inspired what was called the Cha-Cha-Cha campaign. The campaign centered around
rural civil disobedience, and they wanted to force the British to face the music. Okay, that's what it was called, cha-cha-cha. What they did was they destroyed roads, bridges, buildings, but really no people were harmed. The only people that were harmed were people harmed by the colonial police. Okay, so it wasn't the protesters, but the police that were hurting people. So Kaunda considered those actions of destroying property to be nonviolent because they didn't hurt any people. And so once those actions made some of the rural provinces of Rhodesia completely ungovernable, the British were forced to let the UNIP establish a newly independent country called Zambia, and that was in 1964. Kenneth Kaunda became the first president, and he's remembered today for his early leadership and his advocacy for other southern African countries to become independent.
But even if you're not convinced that nonviolence is more effective than violence, there are other reasons to prefer nonviolence. Let's think more deeply about this. When someone says that we must use violent methods to overthrow our oppressors, who are the people who are open to that? Most people do not seem to like violence very much. Moreover, how many people are truly capable of carrying out and sustaining an effective violent movement? War has changed dramatically over the last century, but a sustained violent effort is still going to require a lot of able-bodied, strong, well-funded individuals. An army marches on its stomach, the saying goes, but weapons are not free either. It is not impossible for poor and disabled peoples to wage a successful war against their oppressors, as history has shown. But is violence an inclusive method? Here's how Gandhi explains it.
To me, it is a self-evident truth that if freedom is to be shared equally by all, even physically the weakest, the lame, and the halt, they must be able to contribute an equal share in its defense. How can that be possible when reliance is placed on armaments my plebeian mind fails to understand? I therefore swear and shall continue to swear by nonviolence, i.e. by satyagraha or soul force. In it, physical incapacity is no handicap, and even a frail woman or a child can pit herself or himself on equal terms against a giant armed with the most powerful weapons.
When a violent struggle occurs, the people who join will inevitably be the people who believe violence is an acceptable way to resolve conflicts. How could such a campaign ever result in peace? If we want a coalition of the oppressed, we need to use actions that everyone can use. Nonviolence is a preferred tactic because anyone can do it. I think the Black Panther Party provides a great example of this. When the Black Panthers started out, they patrolled the cops with guns, using the threat of violence to ensure the police didn't abuse their power. During this time, the Black Panthers were very patriarchal, and women in the party were not even allowed to have guns. But women like Erica Huggins and Kathleen Cleaver, Elaine Brown, and Vanetta Molson changed the party from the inside. Today, the Panthers are more fondly remembered more for the non-violent tactics they used, such as the survival program, protests to free political prisoners, establishing international connections, and educating people about Marxism. The FBI documents revealed that their concerns about the Panthers were heightened when the women introduced the free breakfast program. Panthers always maintained that violence was necessary, and their police patrols are also widely remembered, but they were much less violent than some would have you believe. They sponsored schools, legal aid offices, clothing distribution, local transportation, and health clinics across the country. While they definitely used the threat of violence to achieve some goals, Huey Newton kept his gun on his back and used his law book as the primary form of attack on the racist police. And this makes sense. Nonviolent tactics were acceptable to everyone in the community and drew on the skills and talents of different groups of people. Not everyone is able or willing to be trained on how to use a gun, but training people how to work in schools, food service, and healthcare uplifts the community and provides valuable skills before, during, and after the revolution.
Okay, I want you to read the quote and then tell me who you think said it.
Okay.
All right, bet. I do believe that where there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence.
Thus, when my eldest son asked me what he should have done had he been present when I was almost fatally assaulted,
whether he should have run away and seen me killed, or whether he should have used his physical force, which he could and wanted to use, and defended me, I told him that it was his duty to defend me, even by using violence.
I advocate training in arms for those who believe in the method of violence.
I would rather have my country resort to arms in order to defend her honor than that she would, in a cowardly manner, become or remain a helpless witness to her own dishonor.
All right. I'm tied between three, but I think I'm gonna say Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, they got an eldest son.
Okay, good context.
They were almost fatally assaulted. Martin Luther?
Nope, not Martin Luther. You're guessing that because you know I've been reading a lot of Martin Luther King.
Yeah. This is a treatise on violence, advocating for violence. I'm going to say that you're trying to pull one on me. I think this is a Martin Luther King quote.
That's what Keita said. No, it's not Martin Luther King.
Really? My second was Malcolm X.
Malcolm X?
No.
Oh, man. I mean, I don't know if she had kids, to be quite frank, but my third was Angela Davis.
This is an ironic twist, or is this someone I should expect?
You're right to think I'm trying to trick you.
Is this Gandhi?
It's Gandhi, yeah.
Wow.
It's Gandhi. Gandhi said that.
I was gonna say Gandhi, but I was like, that's too on the nose for us right now. I was like, no, it can't be Gandhi because that's just, we talked about him all the time, so you wouldn't give me a person.
Yo! Okay, wow. That's crazy. Okay.
Earlier, I quoted Gandhi saying that he preferred violence to impotence. That may have surprised a few people. Gandhi is the man when it comes to nonviolence. He truly believed that violence was completely unnecessary and set out to prove it with his life's work. So it's very interesting to hear Gandhi talk openly about how he's okay with someone being violent. And that isn't just a single quote that I pulled out of context. Gandhi says things like that a lot. Gandhi isn't the only one. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not as direct as Gandhi, but King's criticism of movements parallel to the civil rights movement that used violence is quite tempered and qualified.
Many people feel that nonviolence as a strategy for social change was cremated in the flames of the urban riots of the last 2 years. Violent they certainly were, but the violence, to a startling degree, was focused against property rather than against people. There were very few cases of injury to persons, and the vast majority of the rioters were not involved at all in attacking people. The much publicized death toll that marked the riots and the many injuries were overwhelmingly inflicted on the rioters by the military. From the facts, an unmistakable pattern emerges. A handful of Negroes used gunfire substantially to intimidate, not to kill, and all of the other participants had a different target: property. A life is sacred. Property is intended to serve life, and no matter how much we surround it with rights and respect, it has no personal being. It is part of the earth man walks on. It is not man.
More so than Gandhi, Dr. King continuously condemned riots as a method of changing society. But he explained that riots are the language of the unheard. King, as often as he condemned them, also sympathized with rioters.
Our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
This attitude is often ignored when we talk about nonviolence today. The great advocates of nonviolence were interested in action more than condemning those who used violence. They were not so concerned with the violence of the oppressed, but more with the more intense and extensive violence of the oppressors. Here's the Zambian president, Kenneth Kaunda.
I enter only this special plea for some kind of discrimination to be made in judging those who do acts of violence. The rich and powerful have a wide variety of weapons at their disposal, which are denied to the poor. The violence of the underdog is strident, crude, and obvious. The violence of the top dog is often subtle and invisible. It spans a range which takes in international economic pressures, control of the media, manipulation of the education system, and psychological conditioning, as well as the more visible strong-arm methods. The underdog demands only this special consideration from the judges in the tribunal at which his desperate actions are weighed. Not that he be given any favored treatment because he is black or poor or voiceless, but that the true magnitude of the forms of violence which can be applied against him because he is black and poor and voiceless be taken fully into account.
I apologize for the multiple long quotes that I used in this section, but I don't want anyone accusing me of taking people out of context or misrepresenting someone. Nonviolence does not say that everyone who does violence is evil, nor does nonviolence say that all violence is equally bad. Violence that defeats tyranny or fascism is not equivalent to tyrannical or fascist violence. Gandhi and Dr. King and others emphasize that they believe nonviolent methods are more effective and less prone to the negative side effects, but it's not the same thing as believing that when the oppressed use violence, that makes them as immoral as the oppressor. Welcome back to the Tatum History Corner. We're going to be talking today about Ghana, okay? What happened in Ghana with Kwame Nkrumah, okay? In 1949, there was a series of boycotts and nonviolent actions. The future Ghanaian president, Kwame Nkrumah, created what was called the Convention's People Party. The party organized the undereducated, the young people, women, and all in pursuit of Ghanaian nationalism, because they were currently a colony of the British. The party began with just like simple sloganeering and organizing, and then this evolved into like creating newspapers and some political educations, even some schools, okay? And then in addition to agitating for independence against the British Empire, this education campaigns explained Nkrumah's philosophy of positive action, which was basically his idea of Gandhi's satyagraha. So after the colonial government arrested the newspaper editors, the Trades Union Congress and Nkrumah called for a positive action day. That was on January 8th. And the entire country was encouraged to stay home from work, so they all went on strike. Newspapers spread the message of nonviolence and especially focused on contrasting that with the British response, the violent British response. And after days of positive action, Nkrumah was arrested for inciting an illegal strike, okay? And that was apparently it was illegal because he was doing it for political reasons and not for labor reasons. But Nkrumah's arrest didn't really stop the CPP. They organized some picnics and dances and tours, rallies, public ceremonies, where ex-prisoners were given diplomas, which they were thanking them for their actions against the government. So they used music and religion to motivate people, and they registered people to vote. Elections had been won in Ghana through some previous nonviolent protests in years before 1949. So the elected leaders, though, even though they had elections, the elected leaders tended to be just people appointed by the colonists. But this time, after all of this work, the CPP was successful and won the vast majority of the seats in the legislature. So Nkrumah was released from jail and he was appointed as the prime minister. So he went from jail to prime minister, okay? Isn't that awesome? And then Nkrumah's government began a series of reforms that 5 years later resulted in Ghana's complete independence from Britain. And Nkrumah became a symbol across the African continent for the power of nonviolence and Pan-African unity. He became an inspiration for MLK, and MLK compared Ghana's struggle to the Exodus story in the Bible. Violence is a versatile method of resistance. It can be used for many purposes, and it doesn't really require much of its adherents, except for that they're capable and willing to commit violent acts. As we mentioned before, this does exclude a lot of people, but it also includes many people who we might not want to be associated with. Violence can be done in the name of fascism, anti-fascism, capitalism, communism, authoritarianism, equality, peace, war. requires very little in terms of principles or aims. On the other hand, nonviolence is a complete philosophy. It is a perspective on changing the world that is principled and honest. Gandhi and Dr. King wanted to see people adopt a nonviolent attitude in their heart as well as in their actions. Gandhi differentiates between the nonviolence of the weak, which relies on nonviolence simply because violence is not realistic, and the nonviolence of the strong, which is a deliberate choice to use nonviolent methods in order to end the cycle of violence. So what types of principles does nonviolence require, and what world does it intend to bring about? Gandhi was completely committed to the strategy of nonviolence. He even believed that it was possible to run an entire country on the principles of nonviolence. He says, without a recognition of nonviolence on a national scale, there is no such thing as a constitutional or democratic government. This is the ultimate goal of nonviolent action, to establish what Dr. King called the beloved community. Nonviolence, rather than destroying the oppressors, seeks to completely change our relationship with each other.
The aftermath of violence is always bitterness. The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community so that when the battle is over, it's over, and a new love and a new understanding and a new relationship comes into being between the oppressed and the oppressor.
The beloved community is exactly what it sounds like. It is a community that is based around the ethic of love. I think Bell Hooks describes this well when she says,
"When love is present, the desire to dominate and exercise power cannot rule the day." All the great social movements for freedom and justice in our society have promoted a love ethic. Concern for the collective good of our nation, city, or neighbor, rooted in the values of love, makes us all seek to nurture and protect that good. If all public policy was created in the spirit of love, we would not have to worry about unemployment, homelessness, schools failing to teach children, or addiction.
As I said before, nonviolence as a philosophy is principled. It acknowledges the unity of means and ends. This is a concept that the means you use determine the ends you can achieve. If you use authoritarian means to overthrow and establish a new government, you will likely create an authoritarian government. There will never be a sharp division between the action and the result. If you can justify violent means while you are working towards some result, you will likely justify violence to achieve the next goal. If you use an army to get in power, then you'll use that army to maintain that power, especially since you'll never completely destroy your enemy, so you'll always have that justification for violence. I also said earlier that violence is honest. Gandhi was adamant that truth was extremely important to the philosophy of nonviolence, which is why he called his philosophy satyagraha. It literally translates as holding fast to the truth. Nonviolence asks us to acknowledge a difficult truth. All of us, oppressor and oppressed, bystander or activist, racist or anti-racist, are connected. Judith Butler explains in The Force of Nonviolence.
For if the one who practices nonviolence is related to the one against whom violence is contemplated, then there appears to be a prior social relation between them. They are part of one another, or one self is implicated in another self. Nonviolence would then be a way of acknowledging that social relation, however fraught it may be, and of affirming the normative aspirations that follow from that prior social relatedness. As a result, an ethics of nonviolence cannot be predicated on individualism. It must take the lead in waging a critique of individualism, and it must take the lead in waging a critique of individualism as a basis of ethics and politics alike. As ethics and politics of nonviolence would have to account for this way that selves are implicated in each other's lives, bound by a set of relations that can be as destructive as they can be sustaining.
Butler's writing can be difficult to understand, so let me summarize. There's no such thing as complete independence. We should still support independence movements, like those we discussed in Africa, but those movements are not really establishing independence. They are ending a relationship of forced dependence. Dependence relations can create a relationship of inequality where one group is considered superior and forces the other group to be completely dependent on their superiors. What we hope to achieve, however, is not independence. There's only one Earth, and we all live here together. Independence is impossible. Instead, we should work towards relationships of interdependence. Interdependence describes relationships between equals, where both groups acknowledge that they need each other and work together to achieve their goals. Interdependence is characterized by reciprocity, equality, and connection. How does this relate to nonviolence? Nonviolence is about honestly addressing this fact, that true independence is impossible. The methods of nonviolence are focused on building interdependence by emphasizing cooperation, responsibility, and mutual aid among the oppressed. One day we will need to build a relationship of interdependence with our current oppressors, and thus we must be careful what methods we use against them. Ultimately, the harm we do to others will come back to hurt us later. That's why people like Dr. King constantly remind us of this fact.
I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly.
Even Malcolm X, in his later work, seems to acknowledge this truth himself. X and King's views started to converge quite a bit near the end of both their lives. And while he never endorsed King's philosophy of nonviolence, X's views changed dramatically after he visited Mecca. X and King began recognizing that internationalism was the next phase in the movement to free Black people in the United States. It was only by uniting together across national and racial boundaries that liberation could be achieved. The end of the dependence relation that Black Americans had been forced into requires not independence, but interdependence. But maybe it's easy for me and Judith Butler to say this. We're white, and so of course we want to say Black people should be nice to the people who have been oppressing them for centuries. It has been white people like us who have done the majority of the oppressing. And if oppressed people start declaring their independence, then white people won't have anyone to exploit. After such a long history of slavery and colonialism, how can we ask the exploited peoples of the world to love their oppressors? Advocates of nonviolence do not ignore this. Here's Dr. King.
We should be happy that Jesus did not say, like your enemies. It is almost impossible to like some people. Like is a sentimental and affectionate word. How can we be affectionate toward a person whose avowed aim is to crush our very being and place innumerable stumbling blocks in our path? How can we like a person who is threatening our children and bombing our homes? That is impossible.
No one has to like their enemies, but we must acknowledge that there is one Earth. This is the intrinsically anti- and individualist nature of nonviolence. What we do to others, we do to ourselves. Pollution, poverty, exploitation, inequality, and other social ills cannot be sectioned off to one corner of the planet or forced into prisons. Climate change and COVID-19 have forced us to acknowledge this truth more than ever before. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Those are some high-minded ideals, but we need to be more specific. What does a society based on nonviolence look like? As you would predict, nonviolence is going to be anti-war. In the book War by Other Means, Daniel Axt explains how the pacifist movement during World War II was the genesis for the nonviolent movements in the civil rights and African independence era. Axt was not convinced that the pacifists were correct in their stance against World War II, but he was deeply sympathetic.
We need the pacifists too, just as we needed them during that long ago war. For the goal is a democracy of the living rather than the dead. And if there is to be death, then there had better be a good reason. When should we fight? Never may be a utopian standard, but it's a lot better than always or often. Even on the rare occasions where a fight is necessary, pacifists have served the useful purpose of demanding that we distinguish ourselves from our enemies by more than just victory. Those who choose the lesser evil, Hannah Arendt reminds us, forget very quickly that they chose evil.
Many of the World War II pacifists were directly involved in the civil rights movement in the US. Most notably is Bayard Rustin, who was a major organizer of the March on Washington. Rustin was a huge advocate of nonviolence, even refusing to fight back while police beat him for sitting in the wrong seat on a bus. But Rustin got his start protesting the draft and American intervention in World War II. The movement resulted in the development of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, which offered advice and support for the Montgomery bus boycott. CORE organized the Freedom Rides of spring 1961 and was heavily influential on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Obviously, pacifism is extremely important in nonviolence. You might ask, oh wow, they were against war, who isn't? But Americans seem to have short memories. The Vietnam War is recognized today as a bad war that we never should have gotten involved in. But we can't forget that the Vietnam War was actually extremely popular. Americans are always against war until they aren't. Dr. King nearly destroyed his entire career by speaking out against the war.
As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they asked, and rightfully so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent.
As an aside, something I admire about Dr. King and Malcolm X is their active involvement in the struggle. They constantly checked themselves against the interests of the people in their movements. They didn't just offer advice from the pulpit, but they aligned their interests with the aspirations of the people in their movements, and they accepted internal and external feedback. So often today we see leaders of some movement start to detach themselves from the struggle. They preach without listening, as if they figured it all out and everyone else just needs to get on their side. Instead, X and King were committed to adapting their rhetoric and ideas to accommodate the evolving goals of the masses. But anyway, nonviolence being against war is not really a surprising thing. War sucks. What is more controversial is that nonviolence is against governments using violence at all. As I explained earlier, governments like to redefine violence to exclude those actions that they do to maintain their power. Governments like to call what they do force and what their opponents do violence. Gandhi saw things differently. Living under British colonialism, he didn't really want to recreate the same violence with the Indian government. He explains that in the nonviolent India he dreams of,
the police will be after our pattern, and not the British pattern. As we shall have adult suffrage, the voice of even the youngest of us will count. That is why I have said that the ideally nonviolent state will be an ordered anarchy. That state will be the best governed which is governed the least. The pity is that no one trusts me with the reins of government. Otherwise, I would show how to govern nonviolently. If I maintain a police force, it will be a body of reformers.
Gandhi's views on police and crime are very similar to those we hear today from the police abolition movement. He says that in his ideal society, there would be crime but no criminals, nor would there be punishment. Crime is a disease produced by the social system, and we should treat all crime this way. He says the guiding light of nonviolence is that violence only creates more violence, and the police are tasked with violently enforcing the law. We don't like to say it like that, but guns, tasers, handcuffs, and jail cells are not really instruments of peace. Gandhi says, without the recognition of nonviolence on a national scale, there is no such thing as a constitutional democratic government. If a government was truly democratic, it would not need to force its citizens to act in a certain way. When a government must resort to violence, it represents a failure to consider people's interests and needs. The connection between nonviolence and police abolition is pretty illuminating. Both movements are criticized because they appear purely destructive. Nonviolence sounds like it means not violence, and police abolition sounds like no police. While those are important aspects of the puzzle, they're not the full picture. Abolition focuses on building new systems and relationships that don't require domination and creating a world where police are unnecessary. It's about recognizing the truth that prisons don't stop violence, but perpetuate it. Rather than destructive, abolition is constructive. Similarly, nonviolence is also constructive and active, reaching towards a future where love prevails in all of our relationships, where we find ways to work together and establish our dignity as people, and where we talk honestly about the necessity of interdependence to supplant relationships of domination.
What I love about these movements is their emphasis on creativity. I'm reminded of when I first went vegan, and I thought that being vegan would mean that it would limit the variety in my diet. And technically, that's true. A non-vegan does have more options, but I discovered that this restriction on my diet forced me to try new foods that I had never even considered. So animal products were so easy that I never needed to try anything else. They were readily available and had most of the nutrients that I needed. But this easiness prevented me from being creative with my diet. I realized that I liked jackfruit and nuts, that non-dairy milk lasts much longer than cow's milk, that homemade pizza is more tasty, and that seitan and tempeh even existed at all. My diet is much more diverse and varied now that I'm vegan. Moreover, I learned that my former non-vegan diet did not truly meet all my nutritional needs. I thought that I couldn't be vegan, but it was actually just ignorance and a lack of creativity holding me back. I think something similar happens with violence. When violence is on the table, we are quick to use it. We might try a non-violent demonstration at first, but it fails because of ineffective coordination. Instead of interrogating the failure and crafting an alternative, we say, well, nonviolence didn't work, so violence must be necessary. The fact that violence is so easy and available to us restricts us from finding a better, more productive way to attain our goals. It's the same story with the police. There are a variety of social issues like crime, poverty, undereducation, unemployment, that we start funding a youth development program or something like that. But then it fails to completely resolve the problem of juvenile crime or something. So then we turn to the police. It's not surprising that some communities affected by violence ask for more police rather than less. It's the only social service that we have on offer. When we want to commit to nonviolence, we force ourselves to be more creative. We must find a solution that works for each unique community and culture and the circumstances that we find ourselves in, instead of just applying the blunt instrument of violence. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
The relationship between nonviolence and the police is inherently contentious. Advocates of nonviolence, including Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, Kaunda, and Nkrumah, and many others, experienced firsthand the oppressive force of state violence. It's common to find instances where police infiltrate peaceful movements, provoking or inciting violence to undermine the legitimacy of nonviolent resistance. The police, as agents of the status quo and protectors of government power, are contrary to the principles of nonviolence. These three values of collectivism, pacifism, and police abolition are indicators of a certain politics that is essential in nonviolence. Yes, nonviolence is socialist. This is obvious in the anti-capitalism of Dr. King, or the Marxism of Kwame Nkrumah, and even the semi-anarchist tendencies of Gandhi. In order to bring about the nonviolent beloved community, power must be equally distributed. Living standards have to be guaranteed, and exploitation has to be eliminated.
The dignity of the individual will flourish when the decisions concerning his life are in his own hands, when he has the assurance that his income is stable and certain, and when he knows that he has the means to seek self-improvement. Personal conflicts between husband, wife, and children will diminish when the unjust measurement of human worth on a scale of dollars is eliminated.
MLK believed that capitalist exploitation was harmful for all of humanity. The anti-individualism of nonviolence means that the fate of the rich and poor are intimately tied together. When profit is the prime driver of society, we get this improved means to an unimproved ends, to borrow from Thoreau. And it was this profit motive that drove us to war and violence. For King, militarism, economic exploitation, and racism were all tied together, and eliminating one would require eliminating all the others for a radical restructuring of all society, along these democratic and egalitarian lines. King's anti-capitalism is another thing he takes from Gandhi. For Gandhi, British imperialism was a capitalist enterprise. While he was critical of the Soviet Union, Gandhi saw its flaws as the same as the capitalist nations. The focus on constant growth and increased material production drove the US, England, and the USSR to exploitation. But Gandhi took this to be a criticism of consumerism rather than a problem with socialism.
Socialism is a beautiful word, and so far as I am aware, in socialism all the members of society are equal. None low, none high. In the individual body, the head is not high because it is the top of the body, nor are the soles of the feet low because they touch the earth. Even as members of the individual body are equal, so are the members of society. This is socialism. In it, the prince and the peasant, the wealthy and the poor, the employer and the employee are all on the same level.
And although Gandhi seemed to have very anarchist sympathies, he did believe that the government should nationalize some large industries. This is the thin line that nonviolence walks upon. Nonviolence advocates a very third world socialism, not comfortable with Soviet-style communism, but more radical than European social democracy. Nkrumah and Kaunda and other African socialists preferred to stay out of the Cold War conflicts between the USA and the USSR. They joined this non-aligned movement. Neither nation offered the third world socialists what they were looking for, which was a revolution against not just capitalist exploitation, but a total revolution of values.
The stability of the large world house which is ours will involve a revolution of values to accompany the scientific and freedom revolutions engulfing the earth. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. The good and just society is neither the thesis of capitalism nor the antithesis of communism, but a socially conscious democracy which reconciles the truths of individualism and collectivism.
So far, I've been pretty uncritical about nonviolence. I do believe it is an underappreciated and misunderstood philosophy with revolutionary potential. But nonviolence is not without flaws. Let's look at some of those strongest criticisms of nonviolence. Let's begin with someone who was deeply invested in nonviolence. As I mentioned earlier, Kenneth Kaunda rose to power through the mostly nonviolent Cha-Cha-Cha movement. However, once he became the first president of independent Zambia, he changed his mind about nonviolence. He explained in his book, The Riddle of Nonviolence, that it's easier for a movement to be nonviolent. People choose to be part of a movement. But when it comes to leading an entire nation with diverse opinions on violence and what is right and wrong, nonviolence isn't so easy. The new nation of Zambia was not wealthy or completely united in its aims, and it could not afford to put resources and reforms everywhere that they were needed. Violence might be needed to maintain the new government. And it's not like violence is never effective. Kaunda admits that violence can never bring peace, but it can end some forms of domination. He says that war is like a bush clearing. The moment you stop, the jungle comes back, and even thicker. But for a little while, you can plant and grow a crop in the ground that you have won at such a terrible cost. Take the most obvious example. Would nonviolence have worked against Nazi Germany? Didn't some nations try that with appeasement? Are we really going to say that the Jewish people should have just done nonviolent resistance and they could have stopped the Holocaust? It seems kind of difficult to believe. I'm not sure there's a good answer to this. But Daniel Ask, the author who wrote about the World War II pacifists, gives us an interesting framing.
What were all these folks thinking? Wasn't it obvious that free people everywhere would have to take up arms against fascism? The protagonists of our story were not gifted with our hindsight, and it was far from clear at which point intervention should be undertaken, or of what kind. Pacifists took the far more radical position that war was immoral under any circumstances, that a lesser evil is still an evil, and you can't choose it even if your survival depends on it. But they also argued that the consequences of wars are invariably much more bad than good, something about which they are often right, and their judgments about possible consequences were heavily colored by their belief in the wrongness of killing. Convinced that good ends could not come from bad means, they would have agreed with John Dewey's insistence that freedom and individuality for all can be attained only by means that accord with those ends.
This is like I said before. When violence is an option, every problem looks like one that should be solved with violence. We should be creative and not turn to violence at the first failure. Maybe the pacifists in World War II were wrong, but if you were consistently anti-war throughout the 20th century, you would have been right 9 out of 10 times. And even if you truly believe that violence is necessary, isn't it better that there are nonviolent critics to ensure that the violence doesn't go too far? Frantz Fanon, a Martinique psychologist and philosopher, is often considered an advocate of violent resistance. Fanon thought that violence was horrible, but it was often necessary. Nonviolence can carry an assumption that the oppressors will change their minds and can be reasoned with and recognize that those that they are oppressing are people. But what if they cannot? Colonization dehumanized colonized people. From that perspective, violence is a method of establishing one's humanity. Consider the difference between Gandhi's nonviolence of the weak and strong. Gandhi claims that nonviolent strength comes from the understanding that one could be violent, but chooses not to. But if you aren't seen as capable of violence, how could you prove that you are? By that logic, you should initially commit an extremely violent act against the oppressor, and then switch to nonviolent action until the oppressor needs reminding again. Wasn't it the threat of violence from the Nation of Islam and the black nationalists that encouraged the US government to support the nonviolent movement of MLK? Maybe the civil rights movement was largely nonviolent, but it was successful because the alternative was violence. Before I respond to that criticism, I want to connect this to a related criticism from Malcolm X. Were the nonviolent movements in the US, Ghana, Zambia, Tanzania, India, were they actually successful? The civil rights movement did get laws passed to protect black people, but the enforcement of those laws required the threat of violence. The US government had to send the military to protect black children who were going to integrated schools. The story is similar in India, where Gandhi chose not to get involved in the Indian Congress, despite saying that he could run the country nonviolently. Instead, the Indian Congress used the violence of the police and army to help them run the country. Again, the same story for Kaunda and Nkrumah. Once in power, they used violence to sustain the wins they had earned through nonviolence. Both, Nkrumah especially, supported violent revolutions in other African countries and seemingly changed their stance on nonviolence. Perhaps nonviolence is capable of winning many things, but everyone turns to violence in the end. How might advocates of nonviolence respond? We must again remember that nonviolence is not the same as anti-violence. Some say violence is never necessary, but that's difficult to prove. Nonviolence encompasses many actions, some of which have not even been conceived of yet. Gandhi would say this, but he repeats that if you sincerely believe nonviolence will not work, then use violence. But violence will never bring lasting peace, and you have to be prepared for the later violent reaction. Gandhi even says, "It is open to a war resistor to judge between the combatants, and with success to the one who has justice on his side. By so judging, he is more likely to bring peace between the two than remaining a mere spectator." Even if we advocate nonviolence, we gain nothing by equivocating between the violence of the oppressed and the oppressor. If the oppressed resort to violence, we should, like MLK so often did, blame the oppressors. If we truly care about nonviolence, then we should condemn the more violent party in a struggle. And the more violent party is going to be the colonialist, the fascist army, the racist government. The victims of these systems may turn to violence, but their violence will always pale in comparison to that of the powerful. So those of us who advocate nonviolence should remember this and focus our anger on the correct people. In addition, not all nonviolent actions require negotiating or reasoning with enemies. We say that a colonized nation is forced to be dependent on its colonizers, but the colonizers are just as dependent on the exploitation of the colonized. Nonviolence makes us aware of that relationship. It's about class consciousness, the awareness that the oppressors need the oppressed. The power of nonviolence is in the recognition that together we are strong, that oppressive power derives from our exploitation. It It doesn't matter if oppressors believe that the exploited are worthy of dignity or respect. If today the oppressed people of the world put their hands in their pockets and refused to work, the world would cave to their demands tomorrow. My goal in this video was to resuscitate the revolutionary appeal of nonviolence. We discussed a few tactics that were effectively used by nonviolent movements and recognized the controversy around whether those tactics are truly nonviolent. We also appealed to the importance of creativity in nonviolence, emphasizing the importance of using methods that are inclusive of the poor, disabled, undereducated, women, and other marginalized groups. Then we looked at the goals of nonviolence, which were summarized in the concept of the beloved community. The nonviolent community is based in love, anti-individualism, and looking for creative alternatives to war and police. Throughout this video, I repeated the controversial claim that nonviolence was not anti-violence. I grounded this in writings and speeches by Gandhi, Kenneth Kaunda, and Martin Luther King Jr. Although nonviolence advocates for using nonviolent tactics to achieve peace and freedom from oppression, it does not claim that all violence is equally bad. Nonviolence and its adherents are always on the side of the oppressed, whatever tactics they choose to use. Although this doesn't fully address some valid criticisms of nonviolence, I think it highlights the radical nature of nonviolence. Maybe you aren't convinced to adopt nonviolence completely, but I hope you come away with a more nuanced view. I hope you remember this video when MLK or Gandhi are invoked to condemn this or that action in the future.
Poverty can produce the most deadly kind of violence. In this society, violence against poor people and minority groups is routine. I remind you that starving a child is violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing a mother and her child is violence. Discrimination against a working man is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical needs is violence. Contempt for poverty is violence. Even the lack of willpower to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. In recent months, when we as a nation have experienced the loss of two of the great men of our time through violent means, we have come to realize and understand the broad dimensions of violence in our society. The problems of racism, poverty, and war can all be summarized with one word: violence, which seems to be fashionable in our society. If we do not stop this madness, we will certainly destroy ourselves and the whole world.